All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are discussing 1 Samuel chapter 20 and specifically diving into the relationship of David and Jonathan and King Saul in the mix together. So far we've had the rise of King Saul. We had kind of the turning point for Saul where Saul did a few things wrong that evidently weren't up to code, and he was told the kingdom's being ripped away from him. We've had the exploits of Jonathan, who's kind of a wild card up until this point. And we see the king kind of descending into madness. Last week, we read two stories where David had to escape from King Saul because King Saul's trying to kill him. And so now this is David's like official escape from the palace in a way. That it's not just him avoiding King Saul on the bad day, but this is David kind of escaping for his life with the help of his good friend Jonathan. So the thing that is interesting at the beginning of this passage is there's a little bit of an issue, as we sometimes get, of like where the chronology in this story kind of takes place. Because the first verse says David fled from Naoth at Ramah and he came before Jonathan. So I believe it is, if you remember last time we talked about King Saul kind of pursuing David and David hiding with not Solomon, Samuel. And there's like this prophetic frenzy, and it sounds like he escaped out the back door. And it like meets up with Jonathan, and they begin to have this conversation where David wants to know what he's done wrong, and Jonathan's response, what do you think of this? He's kind of in a way saying, like, my dad's not trying to kill you. He almost seems oblivious to this. So
Yeah.
what do you make of this initial conversation here?
Well,
I think Jonathan doesn't want to believe it.
Hmm. So Jonathan's just in denial that his dad could be that bad.
Well, I think so because later on, when his father actually comes out and says it in the open, that's the next chapter. I think uh, the he he tells David about it. So
Yeah.
I think Solomon's in denial, but I don't know. Of course,
Yeah.
it could be too that he's just trying to make David feel more comfortable, so he stays around.
yes, that too. He wants his buddy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, he says, behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? So I read that as he trusts that his father is a good man.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's sad.
Or that they're very close, so close that they know each other's minds,
Mhm.
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
is wrong, but let them believe that, I guess. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
The good question. Would you repeat it, Chris?
Yeah, so it just getting us rolling in this of like this initial conversation where we're picking up from last week where David was hiding with Samuel, and Samuel is kind of using his prophet powers to create this prophetic frenzy that you couldn't get close to David. And while King Saul is like rolling on the ground all naked, David escapes out the back door and he runs to Jonathan and he's like, "Hey, your dad's trying to kill me." And Jonathan's like,
I think
and I was just asking for like initial responses. Like, why would Jonathan respond this way when this is like the second or third attempt on David's life here? So like what's going on with Jonathan at the beginning of this story?
Or does Jonathan just think that his dad is just coming out of all this frenzy and everything? Doesn't quite, he wouldn't do anything like that. That's not him.
Mm-hmm.
He
I don't
just
know.
spells.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's been periodically afflicted by some sort of demon that gets at him. Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
Well, it's possible that Jonathan has mixed feelings about giving up his hereditary right to be king, but he doesn't say that at any point. So
Yeah.
he doesn't seem to be all that interested in being king.
no, his father.
Yeah,
But Saul does
yeah,
say to him,
they
you
call
know,
it patrimony.
you'll
Mm.
never get to be king, if we don't get David out of the way here.
Mhm.
But you never hear that Jonathan is feeling jealous of David or wants him gone. No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing I'll bring up that kind of gives a little bit more textual understanding to Jonathan's point of view is the last time was in the story was him speaking to his dad, and Saul was like, I'm gonna kill him, and Jonathan's like, hey, he hasn't done anything, he's a great soldier.
Right.
And let's see, so this is chapter 19 last week. If you look back at like verse 4, Jonathan speaking well of David to his father, and says the king should not sin and kill him. And by the end of that section, Saul swears, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. So in Jonathan's mind, he's like, I solved the issue. My dad said he wouldn't kill you. He promised me, using God's name, that he wouldn't kill you. It's fine. And so that's the approach that Jonathan's coming from, not knowing that his dad tried to kill him again.
That's a good insight.
Yeah.
So, but it makes me wonder how we react when we how is it coming to terms with either sometimes I know it happens with parents as you grow up. I mean, there's almost an instinctual thing that like kids, unless it is a truly tragic household, most people grow up thinking their parents are pretty good. And then there gets to be a point where all of a sudden you understand their flaws. And it's like how like that moment of reconciling, which it seems like Jonathan's having to reconcile for the first time, is like, oh wait, my dad may not be good.
Mm.
It's a huge shock for most,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's a little thing. If your parents, I can remember when I discovered my mother wasn't very good at finding things. When I've lost my teddy bear, and she would always magically pull it out from under the bed, and then suddenly she didn't do that, and I remember being shocked about that. That's a funny thing to be shocked about, but I thought she was magical. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I recall sometime in my lifetime coming to the decision or to the realization that my father did not always treat my mother very well.
Oh yeah.
That he could be abusive verbally, and to people, others, including me. But that realization, is unpleasant, and resolving that, and trying to understand why, and ending up being satisfied that indeed his intentions were good, whether his mannerisms were not. It took time, but I remember that. And I was saying, particularly about, this is Jonathan's father. He's dealing with his father, and it isn't until I gather Saul throws the spear at him, that's enough to convince him maybe his father's behavior isn't always what he'd like it to be. Yeah.
I mean, the other point of view that I think can be very relatable is sometimes people's personality changes as they age. And up until this point, Saul has had moments of insanity or like moments of having issues. And then there comes a turning point where all of a sudden Jonathan's like, oh wait, this is no longer being episodic.
Mhm.
This side of him is now taking over. And I've heard more stories of people who, whether it is just people's values migrating over time, and it's all of a sudden you're like, wait, I don't recognize you. And sometimes this happens with memory loss or other things where all of a sudden the person you knew is like, it's all of a sudden it can, although it's slow, it can hit all at once of, you're not the same person. What? Like,
Mhm.
huh?
Mhm.
And so I feel like
Yeah, the question is, which one's changed? Did the person that's doing the bad behavior change, or is it the person who's watching it? Is his explanation of that behavior or understanding or appreciation of it, is that what's changed? You know.
so I like where you're going with this, Larry. How could you apply that to like what Jonathan's experiencing? So like Saul is having these violent outbursts in like before David was in the picture. Where could that have been used in like a beneficial light, or like something that was more applauded? Like, is there a scenario where that behavior would have actually not been a bad thing?
Oh. Well,
Well,
one comment that Saul makes is that Jonathan could perhaps inherit the kingdom, and if they continue along a pathway, they've got to eliminate David in order for Jonathan to get. So maybe from Jonathan's standpoint, as it was from mine, my father's intentions are good. He wants the best for me. He wants me to be king. Now he has a rather strange way of going about it that I don't agree with, but you could see some benefit, certainly from Jonathan's standpoint.
So others, have you thoughts on this? Is there ways where this kind of behavior might have actually benefited Saul in a different scenario?
well, I'm thinking of him as he's the leader in these wars that they're fighting. They're fighting against the Philistines all the time, and evidently being successful, in part because of David and his skills. But still, Saul is the king, the leader into battle, and so the people of his kingdom might respect him for that.
Yeah. Jonathan also was really good in battles too. At least that he was featured as being good and kind of doing it when he wasn't supposed to, going out.
Yeah. So, but pausing here, like thinking about the previous battles, being able to be a decisive leader is helpful in that scenario. Even having like whether it's good or not is a different question. We're going to put that on the side. Effective is a different question, and being able to be direct with your generals and your leaders and the people underneath you and being able to enforce your will at this time, that was probably a thing that benefited King Saul. And if there was a weak leader under him, it sounds like he was willing to just eliminate them from the process, which probably kept his military ranks pretty strong. The issue comes, like, I'm using what you're saying, Larry, is like kind of using that behavior that benefits him in the military context, but all of a sudden applying it to David, who is his son's best friend, part of his royal court, but also someone who is behind the scenes anointed to take over the kingship from him. All of a sudden, he's using these tools in a maladaptive way. And so Saul probably doesn't see the issue with it because he uses the tools over here. And I think that can in and of itself be like an interesting question for us of, are we using something that works in one venue, applying it to a different venue, and it's actually not a good tool in a different context? Because that's what I'm wondering if Saul is doing, which is why Jonathan's all of a sudden going, wait, my dad is acting like my dad does. It's just all of a sudden it seems monstrous in a different context.
Mhm.
Don't you think too that Saul is very uncomfortable with the fact that the replacement that appears to be coming, David, is looked at being so much stronger and better than himself? So you call it jealousy, whatever, but I think it's uncomfortable when you see that your replacement is being recognized as being so superior than you have been.
Mm-hmm.
I think you'd kind of dig in your heels and could kind of lose your temper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to build on that, the other thing is like Saul started from scratch. Saul started as a king with no kingdom. He had to like make one. And so he's had all this hard work. And now David's gonna come in and just like stand on his shoulders. Like his replacement, that I'm wondering if part of me wonders if Saul sees himself in David, because Saul's no longer young. He's no longer on the front. Like you see him more sending people to the battle lines where David is now going, but Saul used to be the person on the front lines. And so it's like seeing the younger model of who you used to be. And yeah, a little bit of jealousy. And also, they just get to like inherit, take from you, usurp all the hard work you did. Like, that doesn't feel fair.
Mhm.
But there's very little said about Jonathan and you know what a good fighter he is, or
Mm-hmm.
you know there's no praising of Jonathan and what he's doing.
Not here, but
We got
previously.
one story. Where is it? We have Jonathan's like main story where he gets featured is back in chapter 14. The thing that we see in that story, which actually like it makes Jonathan a good warrior and a bad king. Jonathan is kind of a rogue. He just wants to go off and cause trouble. He's not commanding his people. Jonathan's never seen in that like in the mid-level of the military where he's like taking orders and giving orders. Jonathan's just like, "Hey, I'm leaving." And he just causes trouble, which is not actually well suited for leadership. So it's one of those, we do get like a highlight of what he's able to do, and he's a good strategist, but he's not necessarily, his leadership qualities are not being highlighted. Where David seemingly has been placed at like that mid-level place in the military, because Saul's trying to get him killed and instead is like training him as a general, which is ironic. So, but in that way, David has more training that it takes to be king. Or like an effective leader. I'll say it that way.
He has a personality that fits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
I also wonder if Saul's relationship with David as a caretaker, harpist, whatever, is a conflict as he evaluates him as a leader. I
Say
mean,
more.
he's, well, just because he had this extensive relationship with him as a companion, and he got to know him, and they apparently chatted a lot while he was playing his instrument and soothing Saul. So, I think in Saul's head that could be a disturbing factor as he looked at him as the king.
So in a way that David has had access to the interior life of Saul, which means he probably knows Saul's weak points, his vulnerabilities. He understands what makes the man tick. And who better to usurp the king but the one who knows his inner mind? Yeah, it's that is in a way very scary. So let's bring it back to the text we have today. So David and Jonathan are talking, and David is very blunt of like, listen to me. But they hatch this plan. And this plan is unusually intricate. And we're gonna talk about it beat by beat to try to understand exactly what's happening and then how they also ignore the plan, which I find funny. So the plan is that there's going to be this new moon festival. This is my notes are saying this is a regular time to have sacrifices and put on a feast. Because remember, every time you do a sacrifice, you get an influx of meat that kind of needs to be eaten right away. So David's like, okay, we're going to set this up. This feast is 3 days long. I am going to be gone from it. Tell your dad I'm going to Bethlehem. Basically, I'm going to my hometown because they're having a feast and it's important and I want to do this with my brothers. If Saul is okay with me just leaving and going to see my family, I'll trust you that everything's okay at the court. But if your dad's mad that I went to see my family, you have to tell me and we're going to agree that means your dad's trying to kill me. I think in a way of like keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. He's like, your dad's trying to keep me close because he's trying to kill me. And so that's the initial plan. And so what do you think of this? Of like the initial plan is like David's just gonna be absent, and if the king's mad, we're gonna know that he is bloodthirsty. Simple enough?
Well, and by his being gone, he certainly raises the ire of Saul because he's not spending time with him. He went back to that lowly Bethlehem and his dad, who, and those brothers. So that's kind of a slap in the face at Saul. Don't you want to be with your family at holidays? And in this case, Saul intends to be the family where David should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because as we know from previous texts, David's kind of been adopted by the royal family.
Yeah.
I mean, he married into it, but it's his in-laws want him there. Yeah, Larry, did I see you?
Yeah. Well, I just was wondering why they devised this strange thing. I'll shoot 3 arrows, and if they go this far, you do this. If they go that far, you do that. Why didn't David say, "Hey, Jonathan, if your father threatens to kill me, let me know and I'll get out of here."
Yes.
And what if you have a bad time with the arrow and you can't get it any place? I mean, what if it drops to the ground right there in front of you?
So
this makes for a better story, though.
yes, it does.
I mean,
so Larry, the part you added on was like the second part of the plan where David's like, okay, like they agreed to the initial plan, like David's gonna be gone, Jonathan's gonna check in, and then David's like, how are you gonna let me know?
No.
So to explain this just a little bit, of like how castles and walled cities work with agriculture. So we know from some of the previous texts that where the royal palace is at this point is a walled city because Saul's daughter that David married, she has a house
House
on the wall. The
wall,
thing is, cities are where the urban, where the concentration of people are. It's where the houses are. It's where the markets are. It's where if there's a siege, you can wall it off and stay. There should be a water source somewhere in the city. What the city doesn't have is agriculture. So the purpose of a walled city is everyone lives in there. And then during the day, you open the gates and all the farm people farm outside of the city. And so around the walled city would just be fields and fields and fields, often depending on how it's situated, what kind of land it is. But generally speaking, there would be the city at the center and a big donut of agriculture around it.
Mm-hmm.
So what this plan allows for, theoretically, is that Jonathan can stand on the wall, not leave the city, and shoot the arrows to David, who is in the agricultural space. He's not in the city because he doesn't want to be trapped in the walls if Saul gets mad. So Jonathan can do this without being suspected of being in the fields with David, the traitor. Jonathan can do it from a safe point. So the plan is hatched for Jonathan's safety and kind of to make it so no one notices. Nothing's up. Jonathan's just practicing his archery, and evidently he's a pretty good archer. And arrows are expensive. And so, of course, if it's even on the battlefield, people were known to the arrowhead is particularly expensive. So you would, even if you have to make a new shaft, you would collect the arrowheads. But a prince doesn't collect his arrowheads, so it makes sense that he would send his servant out to collect his arrows for his target practice. So the idea is Jonathan can do something that he does all the time, but discreetly send a message to Jonathan, or to David, who is watching this happen.
Okay.
So does that make more sense that way?
No. Yeah.
The wall is interesting. And now here we go back to this. You had said earlier, do they live in houses? Yes and no.
Yeah. The textual clues seem to indicate that Saul has set up camp in likely a pre-established city. Or it's kind of been the walled city has been assimilated into the Israelite culture.
Oh yeah, right. Because they could have just taken it over.
Right. So it does seem to be that they're in permanent structures. The tabernacle is still the tabernacle. So the Ark of the Covenant's still in a tent. And that becomes a big deal later on for David he's like, I'm in a house, but God's in a tent. This is not, but that also moving God from the tabernacle into the temple is also a change of identity for the people. We'll get to that later on, because that is actually an interesting cultural shift. However, for now, just know that, yeah, it does seem to be that there is some kind of palace. I say palace very loosely. It's just like the richest house on the block. It is not fancy. They are not yet in Jerusalem, because David is the one who moves the capital to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's actually kind of still a pagan city at this point, which is interesting. So there has been something happening. So there is a royal house of some kind, to put it. At least the textual evidence is saying so. I'm not saying everyone has permanent houses. There still are nomadic people, but it seems like there is a royal palace.
But there are quite a few people. Saul has slain his thousands and David and David said, well, you have to collect these 200 foreskins, which meant he had to kill 200 of them. So there's a fair amount of people around.
There are, yeah. I mean, it's still not the population density we understand today. I don't have the numbers right now, but let me make a note and let me see if I can research the town and see what textual evidence we can get of where they are and kind of like how many people they expect to be in this area. When they're talking about how many people they're killing, the numbers are probably exaggerated a little bit, but they're also killing enemies over there, so it's a little bit different. Okay. All right. So with that, the other thing that is really interesting, we talked about this before, but we really see it highlighted in this passage, especially in this initial conversation between David and Jonathan, is their relationship, where you see a lot of closeness, a lot of affection. And this is one where a lot of people have wondered, like, what's going on between these two? Because there's already mention of a covenant between the two of them that is in verse 8. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant because you have brought your servant into a sacred covenant with you. We weren't told what covenant that was. That's from earlier in the text when they became friends. And we see that Jonathan even then loved him as his own self. But then when Jonathan's making his promises of like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to let you know what my dad's thinking. We see in verse 14, if I am still alive, show me the faithful love of the Lord. But if I die, never cut off your faithful love from my house, even if the Lord was to cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of this earth. So what do you make of that? So Jonathan's like, hey, like, show me faithful love always, even if God kills me, even if he kills all of David's enemies, which in this point, Jonathan's kind of acknowledging that his dad is one of them. Never, like, covenant with me that you'll never stop loving me and being faithful to me. So what do you think of this request for David?
Seems that David is really scared. He's afraid that he's afraid he's going to be killed, but he's also afraid of losing Jonathan. It must be recognizing that Jonathan's may be conflicted.
So what I just read was actually, that wasn't coming from David, that was coming from Jonathan. Jonathan's like, if I die, if Jonathan dies,
oh, I'm sorry. I got it.
Be faithful to me and don't stop loving me.
Yes, okay.
And in a sense, protect my house, my household.
And my family in the future. That becomes an issue.
Okay.
Yeah, Larry?
Well, and the bond between them depends upon their lives. You know, somebody's trying to kill them, you know, and, you know, that bond or that need for that relationship is something, you know, I mean, we don't see that. I mean, I'm not loving somebody because I think they're keeping somebody from killing me. You know, that I can't, I don't know if we can appreciate that sort of bond. Is that the same that you see often in, say, servicemen, you know, in the army, you know, where somebody actually physically saves somebody's life, and how they feel about that other person. That seems to be sort of a different sort of relationship that many of us have never experienced, you know. So what is it like, you know? I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a homosexual sort of thing.
No.
Some people have it's a different, it's got to be different sort of relationship, I would think.
It's the stories that are available about that. It's over time. Mostly Second World War, that it lasts forever. I mean, that kind of loyalty to the people that you fought with, and maybe saved you at one time, or you saved them, goes on forever. I mean, it's sort of, even if the person died, they still talk about it.
But the thing is, I don't think, okay, we don't know what kind of a relationship they had, honestly. But even if it were what we would call a homosexual relationship, even if it were, in a way, so what? I mean, it wasn't part of their, it didn't bother, they didn't recognize it as anything unique except friendship. I mean, I don't know. I guess I wouldn't want to say, well, so what if they are homosexual? I mean, really? Okay.
I mean, so that there's a few pieces to this that I think are like we're trying to tease apart, and I think it's important because there's a point where their relationship, like no matter what modern label we put on it, their relationship is intense. There is intensity to it. And I think being able to say, like, it is hard for us to understand unless we have had like some kind of situation where we had to rely on someone for our survival. Because there's a vulnerability. Like Jonathan could theoretically flip and betray David. It would be so easy to do that. And so like the fact that he is like, I trust you, I'm relying on you, like there is that dependence, but there also seems to be an acknowledgement on Jonathan's part. And this is where you wonder if the like authors are reading this back into the text, or if Jonathan knew that his father's kingdom was doomed, or his dynasty was doomed. Because Jonathan seems to have this acknowledgement that his life is in peril too. And his life is in peril because of David, not because David's trying to kill him, but like David is a threat to him. And so they both have this fear of death and security in each other, which creates this very intense bond. Now, Gretchen, to kind of your point, like I'm sure you have read similar things to the things I know. They did not have a concept of homosexuality.
Right.
Like that was the fact that it was like something that could be a part of your identity that develops so much later. It's actually a fairly recent thing that people understand that like, oh, this is not just a set of actions you can do. This is like a way someone can be in the world. So having like a loving relationship between two people of the same gender, that if you told them that, they would like their brains would malfunction. The ancient world and in the Near East did not understand that. There was temple practices in pagan cultures that were same sex. But that's not the same as having a lifelong committed relationship. It was just seen as a sexual act, and specifically a pagan sexual act, which is why they think there is some text in Leviticus that says don't do it. They're basically saying don't go to the pagan temples to do that stuff. You're not pagan, don't do it. And so it's a way of identity creation. But this brings up another kind of facet, which is where I think this story is really interesting, is do we have friendships that have an intense, close, loving bond? Because for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it the Hallmark industrial complex. I don't know. But this idea that has come out of our modern culture is that your marriage is the most important relationship of your entire life, has come sometimes at the detriment of close friendships, where there's been other ways of arranging society where close friendships were actually considered more important than your marriage. And this is one slice of that world where, like, the women had the women's sphere, the men had the men's sphere, and probably friendship came at the detriment of marriage. But now we have the reverse where marriage is put on a pedestal, where like little girls dream of nothing more than the white dress they will wear, which I never understood that, but it's one of those that it's thought that you will be fulfilled if you have a good marriage. You don't need friends if you have a good marriage because all your emotional needs will be taken care of. And this is actually showing a different story of David's emotional needs are being met by his best friend. Or, I mean, because, but like it or not, he is married, but he's not going to his wife in the same way that he's going to his best friend. So, how do we balance this in our modern world of, like, for our modern sensibilities, our marriages are like first and foremost, but how do we keep friendships equally, like, should they be equally important? Should we put more emphasis on those relationships? Like, where do we go for our emotional needs? And is it, how do we kind of, I think this is my own point. I'll put it in my own point of view. I think putting all your emotional needs onto one person actually hurts the relationship.
Oh, it does.
And so how do
Yeah.
we cultivate close relational bonds outside of romance?
Women do it by going to lunch together. But I mean, I think that whole idea that everything is in marriage and you shouldn't, well, and I don't know, you have mixed feelings about this. Oh, you shouldn't keep any secrets from your spouse, or your spouse should know you entirely and you tell them everything. Well, I don't know. I mean,
Well, yeah.
yeah.
Well, I discovered fairly early that women were a lot better at having empathy and understanding what you were going through than men. And certainly I wasn't going to get my emotional needs met, or not most of them anyway, in my marriage. And I thought, well, I didn't see that as a horrible thing. I just was disappointed. I didn't think it was going to be like that.
So, Sue, do you feel like you were fed the narrative that like your marriage will meet your needs and then you found out it didn't? Is that what I'm hearing?
I thought so. I'm older now so that I still have that fantasy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But one of the things I think men often expect that they'll have all their emotional needs met by their wives because they don't always have close friends. I think they do more now than they used to, but I used to say when I was working that men seemed to have closer friends if they went to Catholic high school or something like that, because there was, some men have close friends with other men and some don't, I guess.
Larry?
I was just thinking, Sunday I got a telephone call from a man who's been a friend since grade school.
Wow.
In fact, we roomed together. He was an usher at our wedding. We roomed together the freshman year. We were in medical school. Although we've not seen one another in years, every year at Christmas time, he's called me on the phone. And he called me on Sunday. And usually, we just have the usual sort of conversation about things, but that relationship has really meant a lot, I think, to both of us, even.
Oh, yeah.
And this year, of course, he's got metastatic prostate cancer now, and things aren't looking good from his standpoint. I'll tell you that really got to me. It's I'll end up being, well, the two of us are the only surviving members of our wedding party, and Looks like pretty soon
Mhm.
I'm going to be the only surviving member.
Mhm.
Hard.
Yeah. Age is not for sissies, is it?
No, it certainly
Growing
isn't.
old, it's not, I mean, it really is,
No, no,
Mhm.
no.
yeah. And in a way, that speaks to the need to have a wide circle of people that you are engaged with,
Absolutely.
rather than just one person.
Yes.
But I
Absolutely.
think it's an interesting point you bring up, Chris, about our modern sensibility about
Mhm,
marriage
mhm,
Mhm.
and family.
Yeah.
mhm, mhm.
Mhm.
Well, and I think one thing that's different in today's world too is, women have careers. And so it's not like you're at home and, looking at your husband as, oh, wow, here's an adult who's coming home. Um, you're out there in a job and there's a lot of people around you that you're also, so that makes a change in relationships too.
Mhm,
So one of the things that I keep track of, just because I think it is one of the things that church community does better than other areas of like secular versions of this, is like a community of people that check in on each other and reading about loneliness and what's causing the increase of people feeling lonely. And so one researcher looked at how often people have dinner with neighbors.
mhm,
Um, on weekends and weeknights, how many people are hosting dinner parties? And what they have found is a very, very dramatic drop off of dinner party culture,
Yes.
of hosting, of going over to people's houses. Part of me is baffled because people, like, when you look at data from like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, people were having dinner parties on weeknights, which I'm just like, okay, that is a
mhm,
different world than the one that I grew up in. Um,
mhm.
is that people were regularly, like 4 times a week, having people over or going somewhere was not unusual. And what they found was the steep drop off happened actually be, as you mentioned, when women entered the workforce,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because what they found is you needed someone who didn't have a job because the job became relationship.
Mhm.
And
Mhm,
so between a lot of civic volunteering, PTA, church attendance, all of this actually drops off the moment that both you, in order to have a stable life, you are required to have two incomes. And I think that is also slightly different. Initially, it's their incomes were still high enough that you could survive on one, and two made it better. But now, income households are like, being a single income household is a status marker. You have to have one person who earns the salary of two people in order to stay at home. It's no longer cost effective otherwise. But what we see is decreased relationships, decreased sense of community, and decreased dinner parties, which is so sad. And so I don't have a solution for this, but it is just an acknowledgement of, we are not building up relationships that kind of go on either end of married couples, which is why a lot of married couples are expressing stress and childcare and all of these things, that there's trickle down effects. And if parents are tired, if they're not getting rest, if they're not socializing, they're also not coming to church. And so I think that's why we should care a lot, is church attendance goes up when people have more time. Yeah,
I
Larry.
have two daughter-in-laws, one of them works full-time, simply, I think, because they need two incomes to support the way they live. The other one she works because she says, God damn it, I've got a PhD too, and I can get a job just like you do.
Right.
And so I don't
And
think
the world may be better for it. I mean, I heard somebody a comment like, well, every woman should stay home and take care of the kids. We wouldn't need daycare and all that. And I was like, what world do you live in? But think about what that person who is working may be adding to the world.
Whoa, yeah,
right. I don't think it's proper to try to rewind the clock. That's not
no.
rewinding the clock
Yeah.
is not what we should do, but it is an acknowledgement of like what would promote healthy community, like what kind of support systems allow for certain behaviors, where instead of shaming people into like using shaming guilt of you should do this, we should look at what environmental factors or what cultural factors, what have we done to create this environment where people don't have friends and they're not going to dinner parties. What can we change in the system to encourage this behavior if we think it's good?
Well, I think a church, and certainly most of us here, have found that at Northminster. It's a wonderful place to meet with people and
Absolutely.
But I'm telling you, as long as there is Saturday morning sports, working parents will want one day to sleep in.
I think one of the things you do, I gave dinner parties until I was divorced. Even a few times after that, I gave big parties. But it is very hard when you work full time. I remember, and you don't have anybody helping. But dinner parties were fun. But the person who has to do all the cooking. Nowadays, I think people go out to eat. They go to a restaurant if they, But you can't sit in a restaurant until midnight and talk like you do at a dinner party.
Anyways, that's food for thought. We only have a few minutes left. Let's bring it back to the text once again.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the text. Oh, yes.
Text, yeah, we are studying the Bible here.
Oh, yeah. Well, you asked us.
I know. I'm leading the discussion. I brought us off on a tangent. Now I'm bringing us back. So we've talked about different pieces just to try to like connect the threads through. So they have this plan of Jonathan asking, David's going to hide in the field, arrows, boy going to collect it, yada, yada. So Jonathan goes through with the plan. Day one, Saul is like, David's missing. But it's day two where he's like, okay, Jonathan, what's going on with David? And he's like, oh yeah, he went home to Bethlehem to celebrate with his brothers. And like David predicted, his dad becomes enraged. His insult is fascinating. Saul in anger says to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman. He is basically calling his mother an adulterer or like a prostitute. You son of a whore is kind of what he's saying. Do you not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse over your own shame, the shame of your mother's nakedness? Basically saying your mother is shamed because you are a terrible son. But also the shame of your mother's nakedness is like a weird, I mean, it isn't weird for the ancient world. It was the ancient worlds talking about like their honor culture. And so like women were shamed when they were naked because men are, it's like a weird purity culture thing. Anyways, his point is you are choosing this outsider over your own family because don't you know you could be king. Yeah. But we have to eliminate him. And this is directly going against God's plan. And he's like, we can overrule God's plan. We just have to get rid of David.
But isn't it also laying the blame on Jonathan's behavior on his mother?
Yeah, it is. Yep. Yep, it's the woman is to blame. You son of a rebellious woman. And so, but after Saul throws a spear to strike his own son, that's when it really sinks into Jonathan of like, this is not who I thought he was. This is not the dad that I thought he was going to be. And so he is grieved for David, realizing David's been right. I was wrong, but also David has to leave. I am losing my best friend. And so he goes out as planned. He shoots the arrows. He tells the boy, the arrow is beyond. Hurry, be quick, do not linger. And that is a direct message to David. That's not a message to the boy. That's sending a code message telling David to run. But interestingly, David doesn't. He actually sends the boy into the city, and David rises from behind the stone heap, and Jonathan goes to meet him. And so this is exactly what this plan was meant to avoid, but it shows an overwhelming emotion that Jonathan's willing to put his own life in danger being seen with David after King Saul has openly declared death to him, so they could weep in each other's arms, kiss each other, and then kind of have this final goodbye. It is noted in the text that Jonathan's words are very similar to an oath of fealty that is found elsewhere in the ancient world. So the language and the actions, while we see it as very romantic, it was also likely that Jonathan is acknowledging David as king. So Jonathan is almost abdicating the throne, saying like, no, you are the worthy one. You go in peace. I will protect you because you are the next king. So there is an acknowledgement of David's right to the throne. Or at least that's what the commentator that I'm reading is saying that. But there's still like we're talking about like the intensity of emotion. This was supposed to be like a hands off, I'll send you a message, but Jonathan can't help but give a final goodbye.
Okay. Yeah.
And the thing is, I know this because I know where the story is going. If I remember correctly, this is the last time these two will actually speak face to face. The story will go on for another 10 chapters, but they never see each other again. So this is their final goodbye in a way. So, what do you all think of David and Jonathan here?
Well, I always thought it was really hard to teach that in Sunday school about the arrows. I mean, and it didn't quite ever make sense to me. So my kids were like, just whatever.
Just go and tell him, right?
Yeah.
What the basic principle or role of the arrows was so that the message that Jonathan yelled at the kid was that either they're back this way or go beyond. And the go beyond was the message, get out of here. My father is going to get you. I think the arrow was just a point that they could tell, he could yell to the kids. It didn't matter where the arrows were. He was going to yell the message, either come back this way or go beyond.
Yeah. And the message was not for the kid in a way. It was for David to hear.
Right.
I think the confusing part, if the story ended there, I think it would make sense. I think the confusing part is then they talk face to face.
Yeah.
I think that's what confuses people. Why bother with the whole arrow thing if you're just gonna cry in each other's arms?
Well, the bond between these two guys was beyond the arrows. That was over. They still needed to get together.
Yeah.
And that last sentence, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring. This great bond is going to go on for generations. least the next one.
At least that's what they're hoping for. We'll see how that turns out,
Turns out.
unfortunately. So,
What are we reading next week? Are we reading 2 chapters, or I just don't have the picture in front of me? I'm just thinking that next chapter is
I've got it right here.
okay.
It will be February 18th, is that correct?
yeah.
Okay, Samuel 21 and 22.
Okay.
Okay.
That
2
makes
chapters
mhm.
for next time.
So to let you all know kind of where this story is going,
Mhm.
just to kind of give you a few road signs, David doesn't become king until 2 Samuel. So we have a long ways to go before we get to that part of the story. What happens with David is he becomes a mercenary. He will become a military leader, but not under King Saul. And so the next few chapters, the next one in particular, 21, is referenced in the gospel, so it is important.
Mhm.
But there's a bit
The
where
bread.
these stories are interesting to learn about David's character, and this is the one where we start talking about propaganda once again, because we start looking at what is said in the text and what is implied in the text are two different things. So this is about to be David's antics on the countryside. So we're not really going to focus on King Saul. We're focusing on David. But he gets up to a lot of mischief in the meantime. And so I want you to, going forward, we're going to think like, is David a good person, or is David a bad person, or is David doing his best? So read the text, read in between the lines, because there's going to be things that are implied.
Uh,
All right. All right. But with that, shall I pray us out for today?
okay.
Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for the people you put in our lives. You, as it says in Genesis, it is not good for man to be alone. And we give you thanks that we do have companions and partners in life of all different kinds. We gave you thanks for romantic relationships and for platonic relationships, the relationships that have carried us through thick and thin, those that have been with us in the darkest of nights, and those who we laugh in the light of the day with. So I ask that you be with this group, help them connect with one another and those in their community so we can keep building up these bonds where we feel like we are tied together into you. For God, you have made us one family through Jesus's message and sacrifice. And so let us turn to one another throughout our days and weeks ahead as one family, lovingly bonded together in you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Mhm.
Take
See
care.
you next week.